Most organizations still think the problem is we need better dashboards. They are wrong. Dashboards didn't fail. They expired. The executive decision model moved, but the reporting model stayed put. Like a calendar invite, nobody attends, but everyone keeps forwarding. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Dashboards became a success metric. Ship the report, declare victory, move on. Meanwhile, leadership stopped shopping for canvases. They started asking for answers: what changed, why it changed, who owns it, and what we do next. That is the new interface. Early anchor, the executive still asks a human. This is the pattern every data team recognizes but pretends is fine. The dashboard exists. It's gold. It has the right colors, the right filters, a semantic model behind it, and a refresh schedule that somebody fought for. You publish it, you announce it, you train people on it, and you even get a couple weeks of polite usage. Then the executive pings a person anyway. Not because the executive is lazy, not because the dashboard is bad, but because the executive isn't asking for a number. The executive is asking for a decision. A dashboard can show that revenue dipped. It usually can't tell you whether the dip matters, whether it's noise, whether it's a known operational incident, whether it's a forecast issue, whether it breaks a covenant, or whether it's a pricing change working as intended. And the moment the executive asks, should we worry, the dashboard stops being the interface. The human becomes the interface again. Because humans do three things dashboards don't do reliably. First, interpretation. They translate a metric into a story the business can act on. Second, confidence. They can say out loud whether the number is trustworthy today or whether the pipeline is lying again. Third, ownership. They can answer the real question executives care about. Who's responsible for this and what are they doing about it? Now here's the part that kills me. Most organizations measure dashboard success by adoption, views, clicks, time on page. But the hidden KPI, the one leadership actually experiences, is decision latency. How long does it take to go from question to action? Because that's the real cost of your reporting system. Not licenses, not refresh capacity. Time, calendar time, human attention, the delay between noticing and doing. And that delay is exactly why the executive messages a person instead of opening Power BI. They're not trying to bypass governance, they're trying to bypass friction. Scenario 1 is going to make this painfully obvious. The executive asks, why did EMEA revenue dip last week and what decisions does it affect? And the answer arrives before Power BI even opens, not because Power BI is useless, because it isn't, but because the interface moved upstream. The question became the input and the system assembled the response. That's the reality you're operating in. And if you're still shipping dashboards as the end product, you're optimizing for visibility while leadership is demanding decisions. That distinction matters. The foundational misunderstanding, visibility versus decisions. The foundational mistake is treating visibility as if it produces decisions. It doesn't. Visibility produces exposure, it produces screenshots, it produces meetings where everyone nods at the same line chart and still leaves without changing anything. And organizations keep doubling down on visibility because visibility is easy to measure. A dashboard exists, a report was shipped, a workspace has artifacts. Someone can point to a thing and say, we're data-driven. That's not data-driven, that's artifact-driven. The old bargain was simple. Centralize the numbers, make them consistent, put them on a canvas, and the organization will operate better. Dashboards scaled visibility across the org the way SharePoint scaled document chaos. It wasn't pretty, but it was legible. For years, that was rational. Executives had monthly rhythms, quarterly rhythms, decisions were periodic, reports matched cadence. But the bargain had an unspoken assumption that seeing a metric equaled understanding it, and that understanding it equaled acting on it. That distinction matters. Understanding is not a chart. Understanding is the combination of definition, context, and consequence. A revenue line dropping by 3% can mean seasonality, a pipeline timing artifact, a real churn event, a data refresh miss, a pricing rollback, or an incident in the order system. The visual is the least important part. The decision implication is the entire point. Dashboards don't fail because they show the wrong number. They fail because they don't compile meaning. Most dashboards expose metrics. They don't bind them to decisions. They don't encode thresholds that matter, ownership that matters, and actions that matter. They assume the viewer will do that binding in their head, in the moment, while also juggling a calendar full of meetings and a Teams chat full of fires. So organizations end up optimizing the wrong thing. They optimize output, more pages, more visuals, more drill paths, more slicers, more self-service. They measure adoption, views, bookmarks, subscriptions, training attendance. All of that is instrumentation on the artifact. None of it measures whether anyone decided anything. The decision model is different. A decision is not knowing. A decision is commitment under uncertainty. That requires confidence, which requires defensibility. And defensibility requires an evidence trail. What definition did you use? What data did you use? What changed and why you believe it? This is where the reporting model starts to rot, because the dashboard is a static surface sitting on top of a moving system. Data pipelines drift, definitions drift, security roles drift, business rules drift. Meanwhile, the dashboard still looks like it always looked. Same tiles, same layout, same fake feeling of stability. And then people get surprised when the executive asks, "Can we trust this?" And the room goes quiet. Visibility never answered that question. It just hid it. If you want a cleaner way to say it, dashboards scale metrics. They don't scale judgment. Judgment is what executives pay for. Judgment is what they're actually asking for when they ask a human, "Is this real? And what should we do?" The data team hears, "What's the number?" Leadership is asking, "What's the move?" So the value reframe is brutal. The measure of a dashboard is not whether it is viewed. It is whether someone can decide with it. Right now, without a side conversation, without a DM to the Power BI person, without 3 follow-up questions that trigger another meeting. If the dashboard requires a human escort, the dashboard is not the interface. The human is. And once you admit that, the rest becomes obvious. Dashboards depend on fragile assumptions about humans. Time, attention, shared definitions, shared instincts, and willingness to navigate. Those assumptions were always weak. The only reason they held was because the business tolerated latency. They don't anymore. So now we move to the real problem. What assumptions do dashboards quietly require from your organization, and why those assumptions collapse under modern pace? The hidden assumptions dashboards require. Dashboards aren't bad. They're expensive agreements. They only work if your organization implicitly agrees to behave a certain way, to ask predictable questions, to interpret numbers consistently, to make time for exploration, and to accept that the interface lives somewhere nobody actually works. That agreement used to hold. Now it breaks constantly. Assumption 1. People have time to interpret. Not time in the abstract, calendar time, cognitive time. The empty mental bandwidth required to open a report, pick the right page, remember which slices are safe to touch, figure out what changed, and then translate that into a decision. Dashboards assume a viewer sits down and explores. Modern leadership does not explore. Modern leadership interrupts. They ask in teams. They ask in the middle of a meeting. They ask between flights. They ask while walking into another call. A dashboard is a destination. The executive lives in transit. That mismatch is not a UX problem. It's an operating model problem. Assumption 2. Everyone shares definitions. Dashboards quietly require a semantic consensus. Revenue means this, churn means that. Active user is counted this way, and the filters aren't hiding exclusions nobody remembers. When that consensus is real, a dashboard scales nicely. When that consensus is fake, dashboards become argument generators. And the cruel part is that the dashboard can look correct while being semantically wrong. It can be perfectly rendered nonsense. The organization learns this the hard way. You get 2 reports, both official, both built by competent people, and they disagree by 7%. Now the conversation is no longer about the business. It's about whose number is real. At that point, the dashboard isn't a decision surface. It's litigation. Assumption 3. The question space is stable. Dashboards assume a finite, predefinable set of questions. You build pages for those questions. You add drill paths for the common follow-ups. You ship, done. But the moment you answer one question, the business asks the next one, and the next one is always slightly different. Different time frame, different segment, different exception, different exclude the outliers, different what about just partner-led deals, different show me only customers who renewed after a discount. Dashboards can answer that eventually if someone anticipates it and builds for it. But question drift is infinite. Your report backlog becomes a mirror of organizational anxiety. Every new dashboard is a fossil record of some executive panic that happened once and got immortalized as a page tab. Over time, you don't get insight. You get clutter. Assumption 4. The human is the real compute layer. This is the one no one says out loud. A dashboard is not the whole system. The system is dataset, semantic layer, visuals, and then a human who completes the computation by interpreting and narrating. The human is the query planner. The human is the anomaly detector. The human is the explainer. The human is the ethics layer. The human is the does this smell wrong sensor. When the human isn't available, the dashboard doesn't degrade gracefully. It becomes a wall of numbers with no confidence rating. And because the human is doing that work, the work accumulates. Definitions meetings, metric alignment workshops, one-off exports, back-channel validation, screenshot threads, the same 5 people answering the same 3 questions over and over. That's institutional work, and it compounds. Assumption 5. The dashboard is where work happens. It isn't. Work happens in Outlook, Teams, meetings, tickets, and documents. Dashboards are where people go to justify a decision they already made or to prepare for a meeting where the decision gets made somewhere else. That's why dashboards get opened at 8:55 for a 9 o'clock meeting. They're props, not interfaces. So when you hear dashboards are dead, what that really means is this. The assumptions required for dashboards to be the primary interface no longer hold at enterprise scale. The business doesn't have the patience, the shared semantics, or the attention model. Now, the obvious question is, if dashboards required all that and still managed to work for a decade, what made reporting rational in the first place? Reporting was rational, cadence, constraint, and control. Reporting wasn't a mistake. It was a rational response to the environment organizations used to live in. The business had a cadence, month end, quarter end, forecast calls, board packs, budget cycles. And because the decision rhythm was periodic, the information rhythm could be periodic too. You could batch the pain. You could accept that the numbers were as of yesterday because the decision window wasn't measured in minutes. It was measured in meetings you already scheduled 3 weeks ago. That cadence is the first reason reporting worked. The second reason is constraint. Dashboards weren't just a way to show data. They were a way to constrain what the organization was allowed to argue about. A good report narrows the question space. It says, here are the few metrics that matter, defined this way, at this grain, sourced from these systems, and refreshed on this schedule. Everything outside that boundary is explicitly not the topic of today's conversation. That sounds limiting. It was. And it was also governance. Because when you constrain the question space, you can govern it. You can make it deterministic. You can audit it. You can defend it. You can go into a meeting and argue about business strategy instead of arguing about whether net revenue includes returns this week. The reporting era was built on a translation layer. Analysts and BI developers took messy operational systems and compiled them into something a human could process quickly. That translation was not decorative. It was the product. They cleaned data. They normalized definitions. They wrote measures. They made trade-offs. They decided what the org would see and what it wouldn't. And in the old model, that was exactly what leadership wanted. Because leadership didn't want the entire data lake. Leadership wanted a small governed surface area they could treat as real. One pane of glass, even if it was an illusion, one official truth surface. That's also why semantic models mattered long before AI showed up. A semantic model is not a Power BI feature. It's an organizational contract. It's the place where you stop pretending raw tables have meaning and you explicitly define it. Sales means this calculation. Active customer means this filter logic. Churn means this cohort rule. And if you disagree, you argue here, not in the board meeting. That distinction matters because the semantic layer is what let reporting scale meaning instead of scaling confusion. It didn't just keep the visuals consistent, it kept the organization's language consistent. It was governance implemented as a data structure. And then dashboards became the presentation layer of that contract. They were the laminated menu. You weren't browsing infinite options, you were choosing from a finite, curated set of decisions leadership already agreed were legitimate. Plot twist. Reporting didn't actually scale judgment. It scaled the appearance of judgment. It scaled metrics. It scaled consistency. It scaled distribution. It scaled the ability to repeat the same meeting every month with the same artifacts. But the actual judgment, the what does this mean and what do we do, still lived in humans. It lived in analysts. It lived in finance. It lived in the VP who knew what changed in the field last Tuesday. That worked because the system assumed those humans were available at the speed the organization operated. And for a long time they were. So when people dunk on dashboards as if they were always pointless, they're missing the real story. Dashboards were the only scalable interface for an organization that needed constrained, periodic, defensible visibility. But wait, it gets worse. The thing that broke first wasn't BI quality. It wasn't that people forgot how to build a star schema. It wasn't that Power BI couldn't render enough tiles. What broke was the pace. When the business moved from cadence to interrupts, the reporting model didn't fail. It became an architecture built for the wrong time domain. What broke? Speed, scope, and trust all at once. 3 things broke at the same time, and that timing matters. Most organizations want to blame one thing. They want a single villain. The data team didn't govern enough, users didn't adopt, the tool was too complex, the refresh was too slow. But dashboards didn't lose relevance because of one failure. They lost relevance because the environment changed on 3 axes simultaneously: speed, scope, and trust. First, speed. The business moved from weekly and monthly decision cycles to daily and hourly ones. Not because executives suddenly became impatient as a personality flaw, because the operating surface changed. Digital channels, subscription revenue, supply chain volatility, fraud, pricing experiments, incident-driven customer experience. The feedback loop tightened, and dashboards stayed batch. Even when the refresh is near real-time, the decision pathway is still slow. Someone has to notice. Someone has to interpret it. Someone has to validate. Someone has to explain it to someone else. That chain is latency, and it's not measured in dataset refresh intervals. It's measured in calendar hours. The ugly truth is that a dashboard can refresh every 5 minutes and still be useless if the decision takes 2 days, because people don't trust it or don't know what to do with it. Second, scope. The question space exploded. A dashboard is built on predefinition. You choose metrics, slices, levels of detail, and drill paths ahead of time. That works when the business questions are stable and the org agrees on what matters. Modern organizations don't agree on what matters for more than a quarter. They don't even agree on what matters for more than a meeting. Every answer creates follow-ups. Every follow-up changes the grain. Every grain change crosses a domain boundary. You start in revenue and end in customer success notes. You start in churn and end in product incident timelines. You start in what happened and end in who changed the policy. Dashboards don't do cross-domain reasoning. They do cross-filtering. So what organizations did predictably was multiply dashboards. A dashboard for sales, a dashboard for retention, a dashboard for pipeline hygiene, a dashboard for marketing attribution. A dashboard for customer escalations, a dashboard for exec summary. That's not maturity, that's entropy. Because each new dashboard is a new semantic surface area to govern, a new set of measures to maintain, a new set of RLS rules to explain, a new set of definitions to reconcile, and a new place where someone can screenshot a number out of context and cause a fire. And then leadership asks the most revealing question in the modern era: who owns this metric? That question is not about the number, it's about accountability. Third, trust. Trust didn't collapse because people suddenly became irrational. Trust collapsed because metric sprawl made contradictions inevitable. The more dashboards you ship, the more versions of truth you create. And once leaders catch you with two different answers to the same question, they don't just distrust those two dashboards. They distrust the system. This is the difference between a missing policy and a drifting policy. A missing policy creates an obvious gap. A drifting policy creates ambiguity. Ambiguity is worse because it generates decision paralysis. It turns every meeting into a debate about whether the data is real, and then the data team becomes a courtroom stenographer instead of a decision engine. So here's the cycle. Speed compresses decision windows, therefore the dashboard workflow becomes too slow. Scope explodes the question space, therefore pre-built canvases become incomplete. Trust collapses under metric sprawl, therefore self-service becomes self-incrimination. And when those three hit at once, the system does what systems always do, under stress. It roots around the interface, it goes back to humans. That's why executives escalate. They stop asking what's the number and start asking who owns it and can you stand behind it. They're trying to restore determinism in a probabilistic environment. Meanwhile, the actual work of the company moved into Teams threads and meeting recaps and ticket queues. So the data interface, being a separate web app with a separate navigation model, became a kind of organizational joke. It's not malicious, it's just irrelevant. And once latency becomes intolerable, the interface shifts, not because dashboards are ugly, because the business can't afford the delay anymore. The modern business environment interrupts, drift, and zero patience. Modern organizations don't run on review sessions anymore, they run on interrupts. The decision room isn't a conference room with a dashboard on the wall. It's a Teams thread with 3 time zones, a meeting recap nobody fully read, an email forwarded without context, and a ticket queue that quietly holds the truth. That's where work actually happens. That's where the pressure shows up. And that's where the question gets asked. Not as a request for a chart, but as a demand for a move. This is the uncomfortable truth. Dashboards are built like destinations. Modern work is built like a stream. So people stop traveling to the dashboard. They pull the question into the stream. They ask it where they are. They ask it in chat, in the meeting, in the doc they're editing, and in the inbox that's already on fire. That is not user laziness. That is the natural behavior of a system optimizing for time. And then there's drift, not data drift in the machine learning sense, question drift, organizational drift. The constant low-grade mutation of what the business actually wants to know. You can ship a dashboard that answers what is EMEA revenue, and you can even make it pretty. But the next question is never what is EMEA revenue? It's why did it change since Tuesday? Then it's is that tied to the discount program? Then it's exclude the partner deals because those are lagging. Then it's who approved the pricing exception? Then it's which accounts are at risk next week. That's not a dashboard problem. That's the natural shape of decision-making. One answer spawns another question immediately. Dashboards were never designed for infinite follow-ups. They were designed for finite, pre-approved exploration. When you try to stretch that model to match real decision behavior, you get a familiar pattern. More pages, more drill-throughs, more slices, more executive summary tabs that are just the same metrics with bigger fonts. That's not scaling, that's coping. Now layer in the third factor, zero patience. And to be clear, zero patience isn't a personality defect. It's a consequence of operating at higher velocity under higher accountability. Leaders don't have time to interpret a canvas because the organization punishes slow decisions more than it punishes imperfect ones. So they optimize for speed and they outsource the interpretation step to whoever can collapse it fastest. That's why the human becomes the interface again, the analyst, the finance lead, the operations manager, whoever can answer with confidence and context. Meanwhile, dashboards keep multiplying. And dashboard multiplication is not growth, it's entropy generation. Every new report creates a new semantic surface area. Every semantic surface area needs a definition, an owner, a refresh contract, a security model, and a reconciliation story when someone else's report disagrees. Over time, you are no longer building insight, you are building a museum of exceptions. And as entropy rises, the organization adapts in the most predictable way possible. It ignores the artifacts and roots around them. It starts asking, what's the real number? It starts asking, which report is the one we trust? And it starts asking, who owns this definition? That's the moment the dashboard stops being a decision tool and becomes a political liability. So the modern environment does 3 things at once. It moves work into conversational surfaces. It increases question drift until pre-built canvases can't keep up. And it reduces tolerance for latency to almost zero. That combination doesn't challenge dashboards. It makes them optional. And once dashboards are optional, they lose the only thing they ever had, monopoly over attention. So if you want the metric that actually matters now, it's not usage, it's not adoption, it's not how many people bookmark the report, it's time from question to action. Because when decision latency becomes the bottleneck, the interface will change to whatever collapses latency the fastest. And that is exactly what is happening. The interface shift from canvases to intent. Here's what people get wrong about the dashboards are dead claim. They hear it as a design critique. Like the problem is layout or load time or whether the CEO prefers dark mode. That's comforting because it keeps the problem in the UI layer where you can buy a new tool, run a training and call it transformation. In reality, it is something else. The interface didn't get better. The interface moved. Dashboards are canvases. Canvases assume navigation. They assume a human will arrive at the right artifact, choose the right page, manipulate the right filters, interpret the right visual, and then translate that into a decision. That's not analytics. That's choreography. And choreography collapses under pressure. When decision windows compress, the organization stops tolerating navigation as a prerequisite for truth. So the system shifts the input mechanism from find the right canvas to state your intent. That's the interface shift from canvases to intent. Intent means the user doesn't express steps, they express the outcome they need. Why did revenue dip? What changed since Tuesday? Which accounts are at risk? What decisions does this impact? Those are not requests for visuals. They are requests for an assembled response. And you already see this behavior everywhere. People don't open a dashboard and explore until they feel smart. They ping a human and ask a question, because the question is the natural unit of work. Not the page, not the tile, not the report. So when AI shows up with a conversational surface, it doesn't replace dashboards, it replaces navigation. That distinction matters, because most organizations treat navigation as harmless. They treat it like a minor tax. Click here, drill there, slice this, export that. But navigation is latency. Navigation is cognitive load. Navigation is where definitions get misapplied and where users accidentally answer the wrong question with high confidence. Once the question becomes the UI, the interpretation burden shifts. In the dashboard era, the viewer carries the burden. They interpret, they contextualize, they decide whether it's real, they explain it to someone else. That makes every leader a part-time analyst, and it makes every decision dependent on who happens to be in the meeting. In the intent era, the system carries more of that burden. It chooses the data sources, runs the queries, summarizes the result, and returns the answer with enough explanation that you can defend it. Not because AI is magical, because the system is now designed to compile meaning, not display pixels. And yes, this is where people start panicking about hallucinations and governance, and we can't let users just ask questions. Good, that panic is the correct instinct, because if you treat question as interface like a UX trend, you'll ship conditional chaos, a probabilistic answer engine sitting on top of inconsistent data semantics and eroded access controls. You don't get faster decisions, you get faster misinformation. So the interface shift has a price. The price is that you must formalize intent. You must define what questions are legitimate, what data contracts back them, what evidence trail must be attached, and what permissions gate the answer. The old interface hid those requirements behind a dashboard publishing workflow. The new interface exposes them because it lets anyone ask anything, which means you need a control plane for questions, not for reports. And that control plane is not a chatbot prompt template. It's the combination of semantic definition, identity enforcement, and traceability that turns a question into a defensible answer. This is why the most important change isn't that users can type in English. The most important change is that the system now has to decide what the question means. That's a compiler problem. And if you don't build the compiler, semantic layer, security boundaries, governed sources, then the system will still answer. It just won't be your truth. So yes, dashboards are losing attention. But the deeper reality is harsher. You're watching a control plane migration from a canvas-centric world where humans supplied interpretation to an intent-centric world where systems must supply interpretation. Next comes the technical shift that made this possible and why it's not optional anymore. Questions became the interface. What changed technically? When people say natural language changed BI, they usually mean you can type a question and get a chart. That's not the change. The change is that the system stopped treating the dashboard as the primary interaction surface and started treating intent as the input to the control plane. In architectural terms, the interface moved from navigation to compilation. A dashboard workflow is deterministic in a narrow way. You choose the dataset, you choose the page, you choose the slicer values, and the visuals update. The system isn't deciding anything. It's rendering what you already specified through clicks. A question-driven workflow flips that. You provide intent, and the system chooses steps, which sources to touch, which measures to use, what joins to perform, what time frame is implied, what exceptions are normal, and what to surface as the answer. That isn't visualization, that's orchestration. And the orchestration requires a few technical shifts that weren't optional before. First, natural language became a control plane primitive. not a query language replacement, but a declaration of desired output. The system takes your sentence and builds a plan, identify entities, map them to governed concepts, select the correct semantic layer, generate executable queries, and then format a response that fits the user's role and context. That means the question interface isn't a UI feature, it's an authorization and query compilation pipeline. Second, context-aware querying became mandatory. The same question cannot produce the same answer for every person because every person has different permissions, different scope, and different work context. In the dashboard era, people pretended this was simple because you could publish different reports or apply RLS and call it done. In the question era, the system must decide in real time what truth surface you're allowed to see. Identity is no longer a login screen event. Identity is part of the query plan. The system needs to evaluate who is asking, what data they can access, what documents they can access, and what artifacts can be stitched together without leaking protected context. This is why Entra behaves less like an identity provider and more like an access compiler. It isn't just verifying you exist, it's constraining what the answer is allowed to be. Third, an agentic layer showed up between the question and the data. A classic NLQ feature generates a single query and returns a visual. An agentic layer does multi-step work. Retrieve relevant artifacts, choose between DAX and SQL paths, run follow-up queries when results look ambiguous, summarize, and then answer with explanation. That's why chatting with data is not the same as asking for a number. The agent is doing what your best analyst used to do, picking the right source, validating sanity, applying business logic, and then writing the narrative that turns a metric into a decision. Fourth, explainability stopped being a nice-to-have. If the interface is a sentence and the output is a sentence, you're now operating a probabilistic system in the most dangerous format possible, natural language that sounds confident. So the platform had to add an evidence trail, run steps, query traces, citations, lineage, what it used, what filters it applied, what it assumed, and what it couldn't confirm. Without that, you don't have answers. You have fluent liability. And this is where a lot of organizations hit the wall. They want the speed of conversational answers, but they're still running the old governance model where meaning lives in people and exceptions live in spreadsheets. In that environment, the agent will still respond. It will just respond based on whatever it can infer, which is how you end up with quantitative hallucination and executive-grade confusion delivered in perfect grammar. So the technical change is not LLMs can talk. The technical change is that the platform is being rebuilt to compile intent into governed, permissioned, auditable decision outputs. And once that exists, the canvas can't compete, because the canvas requires the user to supply what the system can now supply faster. This is why Microsoft's ecosystem makes this shift unavoidable. Identity, context, and data live in the same gravitational field now. Microsoft makes this inevitable. Identity plus context plus data. Microsoft didn't invent conversational BI. Microsoft just put the missing ingredients in the same blast radius. And that matters because the interface always migrates toward the shortest path between intent and execution. In Microsoft's world, that path runs through three things that already sit at the center of how enterprises work: identity, collaboration, context, and governed data. Start with context. Most organizations store their operational truth in Microsoft 365, whether they admit it or not. The real story of a revenue dip is not in the data set. It's in the meeting where someone said, "We're changing pricing in EMEA next week." It's in the follow-up email where finance pushed back. It's in the team's thread where sales complained that discount approval is now taking 2 days. It's in the document where a VP quietly changed the target assumptions. Dashboards never saw any of that. Dashboards saw the numbers after the fact, stripped of the argument that created them. M365 is different. M365 is the context substrate, mail, meetings, chats, docs, tasks, the actual operating exhaust of the company. When an AI system can read that substrate, the question, why did this happen, stops being a data visualization problem and becomes a cross-artifact reasoning problem. And the thing nobody wants to say out loud is that why usually lives outside the warehouse. Now add governed data. Fabric and PowerBI are not just analytics tools, they're where the organization can still pretend it has contracts, semantic models, measures, lineage, sensitivity labels, access boundaries. That is the governed substrate. It is the piece that keeps answering a question from turning into creative writing with numbers. So you get a split-brain architecture that finally makes sense. M365 provides context, Fabric provides truth, and the system composes an answer from both. That's the first inevitability. The second inevitability is identity. In most stacks, identity is an afterthought. You authenticate, then you go do the work. In Microsoft's ecosystem, identity is the control plane. Entra doesn't just log you in. It constrains what you can see, what you can query, and what you can stitch together. And once questions become the interface, identity becomes part of the answer itself. Because the answer you get is not a universal truth. It's your permitted truth surface compiled at runtime. Row-level security, sensitivity labels, document permissions, workspace access, and whatever other entropy generators your org accumulated over the years. That sounds scary. It should. But it's also the only model that scales without turning into a data leak machine. The system can't just be smart, and it has to be correct and authorized in the same transaction. That's what identity as compiler means in practice. Now add the integration gravity. Microsoft owns the surfaces where work happens. Teams, Outlook, Word, the meeting recap, the chat thread where decisions actually form. When the answer shows up inside those surfaces, the dashboard stops being the default doorway. Not because the dashboard is bad, because the user never left the work surface in the first place. And this is why the Power BI will be replaced framing is childish. Power BI becomes the evidence substrate. The semantic model becomes the meaning contract. The dashboard becomes an exhibit. Meanwhile, the primary interface becomes a question in the same place the decision is being argued. And the new capability is brutally simple. The system can answer what used to require 3 meetings. 1 meeting to find the number, 1 meeting to explain it, 1 meeting to figure out who owns it. So yes, Microsoft makes this inevitable, not through hype, through topology. Identity, context, and data already sit in the same ecosystem. Therefore, the interface will collapse into the shortest path between what's happening and what are we doing about it. And that's the setup for scenario 1, because this is where it stops being abstract and starts being uncomfortable. Scenario 1, executive question in Microsoft 365. So here's the lived reality. Monday morning, leadership is already behind. Not behind on dashboards, behind on decisions. There's a board pack due, a forecast call in 2 hours, and a Teams thread that's been arguing about pricing since Friday night. The VP drops a message. EMEA revenue dipped last week. Why? And what decisions does it affect? In the dashboard era, the workflow is a ritual. Someone forwards the question to the data person. The data person opens Power BI. They pick the executive revenue app. They wait for the report to load. They check whether the dataset refreshed. They select EMEA. Then they pick last week. Then they discover the first problem. The dip is real, but the dashboard doesn't tell you anything useful about why. So they do what every analyst does. They start the scavenger hunt. They open Teams. They search for the last time anyone mentioned EMEA. They look for a thread about pricing. They open the meeting recap from the sales stand-up. They check emails from finance because finance always knows about revenue problems before anyone else admits it. They find a slide deck where someone changed a target assumption. They message someone in operations to ask whether there was an incident in order processing. This is the part that matters. The dashboard didn't answer the question. It produced a number that triggered a human routing workflow. That's the institutional work you've been paying for. Now take the same question, but assume the interface is Microsoft 365 Copilot sitting inside the same work surface where the argument is already happening. Why did EMEA revenue dip last week, and what decisions does it affect? For that to work, the system has to behave like a decision engine, not a chat toy. First, it has to retrieve the metric from a governed source, not some spreadsheet in a SharePoint site, not a CSV someone exported. It has to use the semantic model that encodes what revenue means in your organization: net versus gross, returns handling, currency normalization, timing rules. Because without that, you are not asking for an answer. You are asking for a story. Second, it has to compile identity into the answer. The VP asking the question is not allowed to see everything. And the system cannot helpfully stitch in a document that the VP lacks access to, even if that document explains everything. That's where Entra functions as an access compiler, not a login screen. Permissions constrain the truth surface at runtime. Third, it has to locate operational context. The revenue dip is usually downstream of something messy: a pricing exception, a discount approval delay, a supply issue, a policy change, a competitor move, a billing incident. Those details live in emails, meeting recaps, tickets, and docs. The system has to traverse those artifacts and pull only what's relevant and permitted. And then it has to do the hardest part: assemble an answer that supports a decision. Not revenue is down 4.2%. An executive question is never just what. It's what changed, why, who owns it, and what we do next. So the response has to look like this. It states the number with the governed definition, the scope, and the comparison baseline. It identifies the primary driver not as a guess but as an evidence-backed link, a pricing change referenced in a meeting recap, a forecast assumption change in a document, a customer churn event documented in a CRM note, an incident referenced in a support channel. It identifies ownership, the accountable leader or team, and the artifact trail that proves it. And it states decision impact, which downstream decisions are now affected: budget reallocations, forecast revisions, hiring freezes, campaign adjustments, commitments already made based on the previous assumption. Now, the key is not that the system can produce a paragraph. The key is that it can produce a defensible paragraph. So it must include citations: which dataset, which semantic model, which email thread, which meeting recap, which document. It should expose run steps, what queries were executed, what filters were applied, what assumptions were made. Because the moment the VP replies, "Can we trust this?" you either have an evidence trail or you have conditional chaos. And here's the punchline: If the VP gets that response inside the Teams thread where the question was asked, the dashboard didn't lose because it was ugly. It lost because it was late. Power BI didn't become worthless. It became supporting evidence, the place you go when you need to drill, audit, and argue about the model. The dashboard becomes an exhibit you pull up when the decision needs deeper inspection. But the interface, the first point of contact between intent and data, moved. The answer arrived before Power BI even opened. And once leadership experiences that once, they don't go back to navigation. They go back to questions. Scenario 2, Fabric Data Agents, Data Activator, from reporting to response. Scenario 1 is about an executive pulling an answer into the place work already happens. Scenario 2 is harsher because it shows what happens when the system stops waiting for you to ask. This is where reporting gets replaced by response. The old model looks familiar. You build a dashboard for fulfillment success rate or fraud rate or ticket backlog or churn risk. You add a threshold line. You maybe configure an alert, something fires, an email arrives at 2:13 a.m. and then nothing happens because alerts don't create decisions. They create notifications. A notification still requires a human to do the expensive part. Determine whether it's real, determine why it happened, determine who owns it, and determine what action is appropriate right now. So the organization recreates the same human routing workflow, just with more noise. Someone gets paged, they open the dashboard, they check whether the number is a refresh artifact, they pull a CSV, they ask someone in operations, they ask someone in engineering, they ask someone in finance, and they eventually write the message that should have existed in the first place. This is happening, here's why, here's who owns it, here's what we're doing. That's the institutional work again. Now the Fabric Data Agents, or Data Activator model, shifts the center of gravity. Instead of publish a report and hope someone looks, you express intent, what conditions matter, what evidence is required, and what the system should do when those conditions appear. So imagine a concrete example. Fulfillment success rate drops below 94% for any region for more than 2 hours. Not tell me tomorrow, not show me in the Monday dashboard. 2 hours. In a dashboard world, you can visualize it, you can even alert on it. But the decision still waits for humans to connect dots across systems. Carrier performance, warehouse capacity, inventory availability, order routing changes, incident notes. In the response model, the agent does that stitching as part of the event. A Fabric Data Agent sits on governed sources, lakehouse tables, warehouse tables, semantic models. It has instructions, it has a constrained schema selection, it has example queries that encode how the business expects questions to be answered. It knows which source is authoritative for which concept. That is not a convenience feature. That is governance expressed as machine behavior. So when the threshold triggers, the agent doesn't just say rate is 93.6%. It runs the diagnostic path. Segment by carrier, segment by warehouse, correlate with backlog, check whether the drop aligns with a known operational incident log, and identify ownership. And then it produces an answer that looks like something a competent operations lead would send. Fulfillment success rate in EMEA is 93.6% for the last 2 hours, driven primarily by Carrier X in the DE hub. Backlog increased 18% starting at 10:05. No matching order routing change detected. Incident ticket INC 4721 opened by Logistics Ops at 10:22. Recommended action, reroute DE hub orders to Carrier Y until backlog clears. Owners, Logistics Ops, and Carrier Management. That's the difference. The system didn't refresh a visual, it executed a decision pathway. And now the governance dependency becomes obvious. Agents only work when names are stable, definitions are stable, and access boundaries are enforced. If fulfillment success rate means 3 different things across 3 teams, the agent becomes a faster confusion engine. If the tables are mislabeled and the semantic model is sloppy, the agent makes the wrong join and confidently explains the wrong cause. If identity boundaries are weak, the agent leaks context across roles and you have a compliance incident disguised as a helpful answer. So the real requirement for response is not better AI, it's enforced meaning. The uncomfortable truth is that data agents don't remove governance work. They formalize it. They force you to stop relying on tribal knowledge and start encoding institutional truth as contracts, semantic models, verified answers, schema selection, and traceable run steps. And this is where dashboards stop being the point. Power BI still matters as evidence. It's the exhibit you audit. It's the place you validate the model and inspect the slice. But the operational surface, the thing people experience day to day, becomes conditions, responses, and accountable routing. That's what decision velocity looks like when you stop measuring views and start measuring time to action. And once you've seen an agent do the routing work your humans used to do manually, you can't unsee the waste. Scenario 3. Power BI as input, not destination. Here's the part that makes Power BI people defensive, and it shouldn't. Power BI didn't die, it got demoted. In the dashboard era, Power BI was the destination. You trained people to go to the report, you built navigation like it was a website, and you treated the canvas as the product. In the question era, Power BI becomes the meaning layer that feeds the answer engine. The report is no longer the interface. The semantic model is. That distinction matters because the only thing worse than a slow dashboard is a fast answer that's wrong. The semantic model is the contract that keeps the answer deterministic. It's where you define measures, relationships, time intelligence, and business logic so that revenue isn't an opinion. It's compiled logic. And when Copilot or an agent answers, the safest path is not interpret raw tables. The safest path is use the same governed measures the organization already agreed to. So if someone asks, what were net sales in EMEA last week, excluding wholesale returns, the system doesn't need a human to translate that into 3 filters and a DAX expression. It needs a semantic model that already encodes net sales and already encodes the exclusions as a governed measure. Power BI is still doing the hard work. It's just no longer getting the applause. This is also where verified answers become a real control mechanism, not a gimmick. For high-value executive questions, you don't want the agent improvising. You want it routing to a pre-validated query path, a known measure, a known filter set, a known visualization if needed, and a known explanation template. That's what verified answers really are, a way to turn common executive questions into governed endpoints. And that's why Power BI remains relevant, even when dashboards aren't the primary surface. Because Power BI provides 3 things conversational systems desperately need: lineage, security semantics, and auditability. Lineage, where the data came from, what transformations happened, what models and measures were used. That's your defensibility story when the CFO asks, why is this number different from last month's board pack? Security semantics, RLS, OLS, and the underlying permission model that decides what a user is allowed to see. If your answer engine doesn't inherit those controls, you don't have an analytics system. You have a data leakage system. Auditability, the ability to show the query, the filters, and the model behind the answer, not as a technical flex, as a compliance requirement. So Power BI becomes the evidence substrate. Dashboards become exhibits, the place you go when you need to drill, validate, and argue. The model becomes the input layer, the thing the system uses to produce answers safely. And the conversational surface becomes the first contact point, the place the business actually asks. This is why the right question isn't, will Copilot replace Power BI? The right question is, will Power BI be used as a governed compiler for answers, or will you let answers compile themselves from raw, drifting data? One of those ends in speed, the other ends in conditional chaos. Dashboards versus answers, the inconvenient comparison. People keep comparing dashboards and AI answers like they're competing visualization products. They're not. They're competing interaction models. A dashboard is a canvas you navigate. An answer is a response the system assembles. That difference sounds cosmetic until you watch what it does to latency, trust, and accountability. Start with static versus contextual. Dashboards are precompiled. Someone decided in advance what the important cuts are, what the filters mean, and what the default view should be. The best dashboards do that well. The problem is that the business rarely stays inside the precompiled boundary. The moment the context shifts, new pricing rules, new segments, new exceptions, the dashboard is still showing yesterday's worldview. An answer can be assembled on demand from current context. The metric, the relevant segment, the active policy changes, and the work artifacts that explain the why. That doesn't mean the answer is always right. It means the interface can keep up with drift because it isn't anchored to a fixed page layout. It's anchored to intent. Now the interpretation burden. A dashboard makes the viewer do the final mile. The viewer sees a trend, guesses what matters, and decides whether the number is trustworthy. If the viewer is wrong, the dashboard doesn't correct them. It can't. The canvas is mute. That's why dashboards create screenshot warfare. Someone grabs a number without the filters, drops it in Teams, and now you're spending the afternoon explaining context that should have been embedded in the response. Answers flip that. The system carries more of the explanation load, what changed, what it correlates with, what assumptions it used, what it can cite, and what it can't see due to permissions. That is not nice UX. It is an architectural reassignment of responsibility, lagging versus near real time. Dashboards can be fast, but dashboards are still a workflow. Notice, open, navigate, interpret, validate, communicate. The refresh rate isn't the bottleneck. Humans are. Meanwhile, an answer engine can operate at query time and can push a response into the work stream where the decision is forming. When you collapse the workflow, you collapse the latency. Siloed versus cross-domain dashboards typically live on one model at a time. You can stitch models together, sure, but the default experience is still this report, this data set. As answers don't respect those boundaries because the question doesn't. Why did churn spike? Is never answered by churn data alone. It's churn plus incidents, plus support load, plus policy changes, plus whatever sales promised last week. Dashboards do cross-filtering. Answers do cross-artifact reasoning, if you've governed it. And that if is the whole game. Here's the deeper claim that makes people uncomfortable. Dashboards scale metrics. Answers scale judgment. Not human judgment. Humans still decide. But the system scales the judgment work that used to sit in analysts, routing to the right source, applying the correct definition, identifying the likely driver, and packaging the result into something decision-ready. When the system can do that, the dashboard loses its monopoly because the dashboard is no longer the shortest path to a defensible move. And this is the comparison that destroys the old success metrics. Because if you measure success by dashboards shipped, you'll keep shipping canvases into a world that no longer navigates. If you measure success by report adoption, you'll optimize for clicks instead of outcomes. The interface changed, therefore your KPIs have to change with it. Dashboards aren't obsolete because visuals are useless. They're obsolete as the primary interface because the business wants answers delivered inside the work with evidence fast. That's the inconvenient comparison. And once you accept it, you stop asking, how do we drive usage? You start asking, how do we reduce decision latency without creating conditional chaos? The new North Star, decision velocity, not adoption. Most organizations still run BI like a marketing campaign. They measure adoption. They celebrate view counts. They screenshot the usage dashboard like it's proof the strategy worked. And if usage is low, they assume the problem is training, awareness, or change management. That's the comfortable story because it keeps the solution inside the reporting factory. Build better dashboards, do more enablement, create a center of excellence, publish a new landing page, rename the report to something friendlier. But adoption is a vanity metric when the interface is no longer the destination. If the real workflow is ask a question in Teams and get a decision-ready answer, then dashboard clicks aren't signal. They're noise. Worse, they can be anti-signal. A high view count might just mean people keep checking because they don't trust it, or because they can't get the answer they need without refreshing and refiltering like it's a slot machine. Decision velocity is the metric that survives contact with reality. Time from question to action. That's it. That's the thing executives actually care about, even when they don't have the words for it. They'll say, why does it take us 2 days to know this? They'll say, why did we find out after it was too late? They'll say, why are we always reacting? Those are decision latency complaints. And dashboards are optimized for consumption, not closure. So the new North Star isn't how many people opened the report. It's how fast did the organization move after the question was asked, and could it defend the move? That distinction matters because it changes what you build. If you optimize for adoption, you build prettier canvases, you optimize navigation, you reduce pages, you tweak colors, you build executive summary tabs. You treat the report like a product and the user like a consumer. If you optimize for decision velocity, you build answer pathways. You reduce institutional work, you collapse routing, you predefine the evidence trail. You encode semantics so the system can compile intent into a governed response. So you stop asking users to become analysts at the worst possible moment when the decision window is already closing. And yes, decision velocity is measurable, not with vibes, with timestamps. When did the question get asked? When did an answer get delivered? When did an action get taken? When did the action get validated as correct or at least defensible? If you can't measure that, you're not running a decision system. You're running a reporting museum. This is also why decision velocity wins politically. Executives will fund speed and defensibility. They will not fund more dashboards. Dashboards sound like operational overhead. Decision velocity sounds like competitive advantage. It sounds like reduced risk. It sounds like fewer surprises. It sounds like fewer meetings that exist purely to reconcile numbers. And that's the quiet shift. The dashboard exists, but the exec still asks a human moment becomes measurable failure. If a dashboard is published, refreshed, and beautifully designed, but the actual decision still routes through 3 people and a Slack thread, then the dashboard didn't reduce latency. It didn't improve the decision engine. It just produced an artifact. So the new KPI set looks different. Decision latency, answer acceptance rate, escalation frequency, override rate when agents recommend an action. Coverage of your question portfolio. Which questions have a governed answer path versus which ones still require heroics? And once you start measuring those, a lot of legacy data work stops looking like best practice and starts looking like expensive theater. Because the goal was never to get people to click. The goal was to get the organization to move, where humans used to sit in the loop. Before the question became the interface, humans were the interface. Not in a poetic way, in a literal systems way. The organization routed questions through specific people because those people acted as translators between business intent and data reality. They were the query engine, the semantic layer, the anomaly detector, and the narrative generator, all wrapped in one calendar invite. Start with analysts because they absorbed the most hidden load. The analyst didn't just build reports. The analyst performed institutional translation, taking a vague question like, are we okay in EMEA? And converting it into which data set, which definition of revenue, what date logic, what exclusions, what currency, what segments, and what caveats. Then they ran it, checked whether the result looked sane, and wrote the human-friendly explanation that made the number usable. That last part is the piece people forget. The dashboard might show a line. The analyst supplied confidence. Yes, this is real. It's not a refresh glitch, and it's driven by Germany and the UK. Confidence is a product. It just wasn't tracked in your backlog. Then there were managers. Managers sat in the loop as context providers and authorization routers. When an executive asked, why did this change? The manager knew which policy had shifted, which project was in flight, which customer escalated, and which team was quietly underwater. Managers turned metrics into operational reality. Sales is down because discount approvals are bottlenecked, or support load spiked because of the incident on Friday. Dashboards almost never included that. They couldn't. Context was dynamic, political, and often undocumented. So managers became the bridge between the chart and the real world. Then finance, because finance is where dashboards go to die. Finance teams sat in the loop as definition enforcers. They were the semantic layer when nobody else could be trusted to be consistent. They knew the difference between recognized revenue and booked revenue. They knew which adjustments were in play, and they knew which numbers were official versus for internal use only. In practice, this meant a lot of dashboards existed, but a smaller set of people were allowed to interpret them without causing a crisis. That's not democratization, that's controlled translation. Then IT and data engineering, they sat in the loop as pipeline babysitters. When a metric looked wrong, the answer was rarely the business changed. The answer was the pipeline drifted. A source system changed a column, a nightly job failed, a join exploded cardinality, a refresh window slipped, or someone introduced a temporary workaround that became permanent. So the loop looked like this. Question asked, dashboard consulted, confusion detected, escalation triggered, technical verification performed, narrative rewritten, decision delayed. That was the operating model. It just wasn't written down, and dashboards became meeting props. Not because leaders love visuals, but because dashboards provided something meetings needed, a shared object to point at while people argued. A dashboard on screen creates the illusion of shared reality, even when definitions are drifting underneath. It gives people a place to anchor their opinions. But the cost is that the meeting becomes the computation layer. People do the joining, the filtering, the exception handling, and the interpretation in real time, with social dynamics influencing which explanation wins. That's why the same dashboard can produce different decisions depending on who's in the room. So what exactly is AI displacing here? Not responsibility. That doesn't get automated. AI displaces routing and translation, the mechanical work of mapping intent to a governed query path, retrieving the relevant context artifacts, summarizing what changed, and packaging it into a response that can be defended. It takes the work that used to require an analyst plus a manager plus 3 follow-up messages and compresses it into a single interaction, which means your org chart isn't the control plane anymore. Your control plane is the answer pipeline, semantics, identity, provenance, and observability. And if you don't build that pipeline deliberately, the system will still route questions. It'll just route them through the oldest interface you have, humans with tribal knowledge, and you'll keep paying for decision latency like it's a cost of doing business instead of treating it as an architectural defect. Why this kills traditional data leadership? Traditional data leadership was built around deliverables. Dashboards shipped, reports published, a semantic model treated like an internal product launch. And if you were competent, you measured success with the proxies the platform handed you, view counts, refresh success, workspace adoption, training attendance. We reduced duplicate reports. That was the old power base, controlling the artifact factory. But the factory doesn't matter when the business stops entering through the front door. In the question era, the business doesn't care what you published. It cares whether the system can answer right now with evidence in the place the decision is happening. That is a different value proposition, and it immediately devalues the skills most data leaders were promoted for, because the old identity wasn't owner of decision quality, it was owner of the BI tool. And the tool owner model worked because dashboards forced everyone to route through your workflow. Want a new view? File a request. Want a new metric? Get it prioritized. Want to reconcile numbers? Book time with the data team. You controlled the calendar and therefore you controlled the narrative. Plot twist. That wasn't governance. That was scarcity. Now you're watching scarcity get removed. When an executive can ask Copilot a question in Teams and get a plausible answer in under a minute, the political center shifts. Not because Copilot is always correct, because the executive just experienced a lower friction pathway. The executive learned a new habit, bypass the artifact, ask the system. And once that habit forms, your dashboard backlog becomes decorative. This is where traditional leaders lose relevance. They keep optimizing the artifact while the organization optimizes the interaction. They keep building canvases while the business is buying latency reduction. They keep funding BI adoption programs while leaders are measuring speed and defensibility. They keep arguing about visual design while the board asks why the organization can't answer what changed since Tuesday without scheduling a meeting. This is the moment the old success metrics turn into liabilities. If you celebrate dashboards shipped, you're celebrating production, not outcomes. If you celebrate report usage, you might be celebrating confusion. If you celebrate self-service, you might be celebrating uncontrolled semantics. 1,000 people answering a question 1,000 different ways with high confidence and low agreement. And the more you scale that model, the more entropy you generate. This is also why the data leadership role collapses into AI leadership, whether you like it or not. Because once questions are the interface, answers become the product. Not data sets, not reports, answers. And answers have a life cycle. They have inputs, constraints, evidence trails, escalation paths, and failure modes. They are not static artifacts. They are generated outputs that must remain defensible under audit, under regulatory scrutiny, and under internal challenge. Most traditional data leadership models aren't built to own that. They're built to publish and move on. But the business doesn't experience published. The business experiences answered. So the natural selection pressure hits. Leaders who can't govern answers will get routed around. Leaders who can't reduce decision latency without creating conditional chaos will be treated as blockers. Leaders who can't explain why the answer is correct will lose trust faster than leaders who are simply slow. And here's the line that usually lands like a brick. If the CEO asks Copilot instead of your dashboard, your operating model already changed. Not next quarter, not in the future, already, because the CEO didn't ask for a report, the CEO asked for an answer. And the organization will always privilege the shortest path from intent to action, until that path produces a disaster, at which point it will demand governance. Not dashboards. That's the trap for traditional leadership. They defend dashboards as if dashboards are governance. They are not. Dashboards are a presentation layer sitting on top of governance, and in too many orgs, they're sitting on top of governance theater. Definitions that drift, permissions that erode, exceptions that pile up, lineage nobody checks until something breaks. AI doesn't create those problems. AI just makes them visible, in plain English, to everyone. So yes, this kills traditional data leadership, because traditional leadership was measured by artifacts, and the business is moving to outcomes. Answer quality, decision velocity, and defensibility. You can keep shipping dashboards into that world. The system will let you, and the business will keep asking questions somewhere else. AI leadership, owning the answer lifecycle. So the role doesn't become AI leader because someone bought licenses. It becomes AI leadership because the unit of value changed from a report to an answer. And answers have life cycles, failure modes, and blast radiuses that dashboards never had. In the dashboard world, leadership could pretend governance was a publishing workflow. You reviewed the report, blessed the numbers, hit publish, and then you let the organization argue about screenshots until the next refresh. That model assumed the artifact was static. In the question world, the artifact is generated at runtime. Every answer is an execution, a compilation of intent, a query plan, a set of sources, a set of permissions, and a narrative wrapper that people will treat as truth because it sounds like truth. So AI leadership is not about adopting Copilot. AI leadership is owning the answer lifecycle end to end. How answers are produced, what they're allowed to use, how they're verified, how they're audited, and what happens when they're wrong. That distinction matters because most organizations are about to do the lazy version. They'll roll out chat, call it empowerment, and then act surprised when the first executive meeting goes sideways because two leaders asked the same question and got two different answers. That's not an AI problem. That's an ownership problem. Owning the answer lifecycle starts with a boring, non-negotiable move. Define the classes of answers your organization will tolerate. Some answers are exploratory. They're allowed to be fuzzy. They're for analysts and operators who know how to validate. Some answers are executive grade. They must be deterministic, grounded in governed measures, and accompanied by citations. Some answers are prohibited, not because the user isn't trusted, but because the system can't produce a defensible response without violating a contract, privacy, legal, confidentiality, or simply lack of reliable semantics. If you don't classify answers, you default to one category, improvisation. And improvisation at enterprise scale becomes conditional chaos. Next, answer ownership means you govern how the system maps words to meaning. Because natural language is not a query language, it's ambiguity wrapped in confidence. When someone asks revenue, do they mean booked, recognized, net, gross, excluding returns in local currency or normalized? When someone asks customer, do they mean account, contact, paying tenant, active subscription, or anyone who clicked a marketing link once? Dashboards avoided this by forcing users into pre-modeled definitions. Questions don't. So you need a semantic layer that acts like a compiler dictionary, measures, dimensions, relationships, synonyms, and constraints. That's what keeps the system from answering the wrong question perfectly. Then comes the part everyone underestimates: evidence and traceability. Answer ownership means every answer is shipped with a defensibility bundle, which governed sources were used, what filters were applied, what queries were executed, and what context artifacts were referenced. Not because auditors are coming tomorrow, because the first time leadership makes a high-stakes decision off an AI answer, someone will challenge it. And if your only defense is the model said so, you've already failed. A leader can't defend the model said so. A leader can defend this answer came from this semantic model, this measure definition, this data refresh, and these supporting artifacts, and it respected these access boundaries. That's what answer leadership produces: explainability as an operational requirement, not a moral preference. And finally, owning the answer lifecycle means you govern the operational loop after the answer is delivered. Dashboards didn't have a feedback loop beyond someone complained. Answers need observability. What questions get asked, which answers get accepted, which ones get escalated, where humans override the system, and where the same question keeps returning conflicting results. Those signals aren't analytics vanity metrics. They are the health metrics of your decision engine. If override rates spike, the system lost trust. If escalations cluster around one domain, your semantics are drifting. If the same leader keeps asking the same question, you didn't deliver closure, you delivered a number. So yes, AI leadership is governance, but not governance as policy documents and committee meetings. Governance as enforced system behavior, semantics, identity boundaries, provenance, and observable decision pathways. That's the new job, because the platform will generate answers either way. Your choice is whether those answers are your organization's truth or just another entropy generator that speaks fluent English. Non-negotiables for trustworthy answers. If questions are the interface, then trust becomes the product. And trust is not a vibe, it's a set of constraints that survive stressed humans, rushed executives, and the platform's natural tendency to rote around intent. So here are the non-negotiables, not best practices, system laws. First, you need trusted data contracts, not just we have a lakehouse. Contracts mean stable semantics, stable schemas, and an explicit definition of what each metric is allowed to mean. When a system answers revenue, it must have a single authoritative definition to bind to, or you've turned language into an entropy generator. This is why the semantic model matters more than the report. The report is presentation. The model is the contract. And contracts have to include quality expectations. If the upstream system produces nulls, late arriving records, duplicates, or inconsistent keys, you don't solve that with prompt engineering. You solve it with contracts and enforcement. Data is valid, complete enough, and refreshed on a known cadence. Otherwise, the answer engine will politely summarize garbage. Second, you need controlled query surfaces. Most organizations think Connect Copilot to all data is empowerment. It's not. It's uncontrolled interpretation at scale. The answer engine must have a constrained set of sanctioned pathways, semantic models, curated views, verified answers, and explicit schema selection. If you let the agent roam raw tables, you're asking it to invent relationships, invent business meaning, and improvise calculation logic. That is how you get quantitative hallucination that looks like competence. The controlled surface is where you decide these columns are safe, these measures are canonical, these tables represent truth, and these combinations are prohibited. It's also where you define answer classes, exploratory versus executive grade. Executive grade answers route through verified artifacts. Always. You don't want creativity in the numbers that trigger hiring freezes. Third, you need identity boundaries that compile into every answer. Identity cannot be an authentication event. It must be evaluated as part of the query plan. That means row-level security, object-level security, and document permissions all need to be enforced in the same transaction that produces the answer. Because the failure mode here is not wrong number. The failure mode is right number, wrong audience. And once you stitch M365 context into answers, that failure mode gets worse. The system can accidentally join a confidential email with a broadly accessible dataset and leak context through a summary sentence. So the boundary isn't just data permissions, it's cross-artifact stitching permissions. You need entra and the underlying control plane to constrain what can be fused. Fourth, governance and provenance must be built into the answer, not bolted on later. People talk about citations like they're UX polish. They're not. Citations are the only thing standing between helpful assistant and legal discovery. Every high-value answer needs a provenance trail. Which dataset, which semantic model, which refresh time, which files or emails, which meeting recap, which workspace. And if the system can't cite, it should downgrade the answer class. I can't confirm this from governed sources instead of guessing. This is where purview-style lineage and catalog discipline stop being compliance theater and become operational requirements. If you can't trace the answer, you can't defend the decision. And if you can't defend the decision, your velocity is just a faster way to be wrong. Fifth, you need observability for the answer pipeline. Dashboards had usage metrics. Answers require decision telemetry. You need to log who asked, what they asked, what artifacts were used, what queries were executed, what filters were applied, and what the system returned. Not for surveillance, for incident response. Because answers will fail, definitions will drift, a source system will change, a model will be updated, and when an executive says this is wrong, you need to replay the pathway like a transaction log, otherwise you're back to tribal debugging in teams. Sixth, you need an operating model for escalation and review. When the system can't answer deterministically, it must route to a human with context, not a generic mailbox, an owner. Answer ownership means you know who is responsible for the definition, who is responsible for the source, and who is responsible for approving the verified version. If you don't define escalation paths, you get shadow governance. People copy the answer into Excel, fix it, and now the organization has two truths again. And finally, you need to accept the core constraint. AI doesn't fix bad leadership. It exposes it in natural language. So if you don't enforce these non-negotiables, you will still get answers. Fast ones, fluent ones, confident ones. And they'll be the most expensive lies your organization has ever produced. The practical shift, inventory questions, not reports. If this landed with you, the next move is not replatform BI or train everyone to prompt better. The next move is administrative, which is why most orgs won't do it. Replace the dashboard backlog with a question portfolio. Because a dashboard backlog is a list of canvases, a question portfolio is a list of decisions the business keeps failing to make quickly. Start by pulling 10 executives and operators into a room and banning solution language. No, we need a dashboard we need a report that shows those are artifacts. They're the wrong unit. Ask for the questions they actually ask humans today. The ones that trigger meetings, escalations, and late-night threads. The ones that generate institutional work because nobody can answer them cleanly. Then write them down verbatim. In their messy political non-analyst language. Why is EMEA down again? Are we going to miss forecast? Which customers are at risk because support is behind? Where are we leaking margin? Who approved this? That list is your interface spec. Now classify each question, not with a governance committee, with 4 blunt tags. Value, does this change revenue, cost, or risk? Frequency. Is this daily noise or weekly cadence or an executive surprise? Latency tolerance, do you need it in 5 minutes, 5 hours, or 5 days? Risk profile, does a wrong answer cause embarrassment or does it create legal exposure? That classification is how you decide what gets a verified answer path versus what stays exploratory. High value, high frequency, low latency, high risk questions get engineered first. Not built, engineered. Because now you're designing an answer pathway, not a page layout. For each top question, force explicitness. What is the authoritative data source? Which semantic model defines the terms? What permissions constrain the truth surface? What context artifacts are relevant and permissible? Meeting recaps, emails, tickets, docs. What does evidence look like for this question? Citations, lineage, run steps, and what's the escalation path when the system can't answer deterministically? This is where most teams discover the uncomfortable part. The question is easy. The answer pathway is not, because the answer pathway reveals where your organization has been relying on tribal knowledge, a hidden filter, an unwritten definition, a spreadsheet correction, a policy exception that everybody knows but nobody codified. Good, that's the point. Those are entropy generators. Now you can see them, then decide the surface for each question. Some questions become verified answers, pre-validated measures, constrained schema, predictable outputs, executive-grade defensibility. Some questions remain exploratory. The agent can query, summarize, and propose, but it must disclose uncertainty and show its steps. Some questions become prohibited, not because you're controlling people, but because you're controlling blast radius. If the system can't answer safely, it should refuse. Once you do that, you can finally define answer SLOs, not refresh schedules. Answer SLOs. For this question, we deliver within 5 minutes with citations using this semantic model, and we log every execution. That is how decision velocity becomes a real operating model instead of a slogan. And the final move is political. Stop celebrating dashboards shipped. Start publishing a weekly list of questions that now resolve without human routing. Time from question to answer. Escalation rate, override rate, that's the scoreboard that matters. That's how you prove the interface shifted and you're governing it instead of being surprised by it. Stop asking, which dashboard should we build next? Because that assumes navigation is still the interface. The only question that matters now is, which business questions deserve instant, trustworthy answers and what evidence trail makes them defensible? Drop a comment with the one executive question your org can't answer fast today and tell me what it roots through, people, dashboards, or pure chaos. Subscribe if you want more architectural truths, not vendor therapy.